Who do you trust? Thank you. It's an important question in life, isn't it? We think about best friends or family or spouses or different people, or maybe do we trust ourselves too? Or yes, do we trust God? Where do we put our trust? In whom do we put our trust? It's a very important question for our lives, and it can make a huge, huge difference on whether our lives go well or whether our lives are very broken. When I was growing up and a young adult, I had the privilege and the great opportunity of working at Lutheran, one of our church camps in North Carolina. And the last year I was there full-time was back in 1991. And I got to be, after my last year in college, I got to be one of the outdoor area directors, which was fantastic. So I got to go out and do hiking trips and whitewater canoeing trips and whitewater rafting trips and all these kinds of things. And every third or fourth week, I would be positioned just on camp to help lead the challenge course and low ropes course and to facilitate that for all the different cabin groups coming in. And some of the cabin kids were young, some were older, high school kids, everything in between. And part of that challenge course, there was a trust fall. Now, who here has ever, crossed your arms and leaned back and had anybody been involved in a trust fall before? Yeah, a lot of us have done that. Now, most of us probably that was at a floor level, right? And you had people standing behind and you were standing. Is that about right? Yes? This particular one is a little bit different because this challenge course, the trust fall was done from a platform, and it's about as high up as the altar is here too. And what would happen is you'd have a line of people lined up this way with hands and forearms out. And then on the other side here, a line of people this way too, and you'd intercross your arms together. And the person would stand on the platform, turn around, cross their arms, and fall stiff as a board all the way back. So you'd be completely horizontal before you'd be caught. So you'd be totally, literally falling. Well, needless to say, with people coming together as strangers, and of course this is a team-building thing, but you don't necessarily, you may not trust your best friend to catch you falling down with your eyes closed, much less a stranger. And so people would be a little bit anxious about the idea of this happening. So what I would do is I would talk and coach everyone through it and get them lined up, and I would be the guinea pig sometimes to go first, especially with some of the more tentative cabins. And we get everybody lined up, and I'd make sure I'd coach them about what to do, how to do it, and to stay there and to be fixed with that, with their arms. And even young kids, if you have all those arms together, you can hold a lot of weight. And I would lean back and fall back, and they'd catch me, and then they'd be very excited about having done that, so they'd catch each other and their counselors too and have this great experience. And would you believe it, through that summer, I got caught every single time, except one. One time, there was this little young girl's cabin. Now, there have been some other young girls' cabins before, right there, planted, set, so it was nothing about being a girl, and they were awesome, and they held on. But this particular little young girl's cabin was tentative, and I knew it ahead of time, but so I was coaching with them through it, and I was up on the platform, and I was making eye contact, and I thought they had gotten over it enough to hang in there and be there, but I was wrong. And so I turned, I leaned back, and I fell all the way, and every one of them, including their counselors, and it was just air. All but two little girls who were right there at the edge of the platform, they caught my feet, which enabled my head to hit the ground first. And I'm pretty sure I bounced off the ground, but I'm not positive because it could have been just my head throbbing and I felt like it was a bounce, hitting all the roots and everything else. But did I cry? No, but I was mad, but I tried not to show it. And actually, from the ground there on my back, I started coaching these little girls who were looking over like, oh, are you dead? Did we kill you? And I started coaching them again on what to do and how to get back up there. And now I would not do this again. Totally honestly, I would not. But then I was young enough and dumb enough where I decided, I want to make this a win. I got right back up on the platform again and talked them all through it again and made eye contact again and turned around and closed my eyes and fell straight back, and they caught me. And they caught each other, and it was a great experience. But that's not every time, is it? And the other time reminds us that there are times when we put our trust in others and we may be hurt. we may be left, and those hands and those arms that we were hoping for to help hold us in some of those key moments may not be there. It reminds us of today's psalm, which is a wise psalm. And that's why I'm focusing on this for today's lesson, for today's message. Do not put your trust in princes, in rulers, in mortals, in whom there is no help. And then it continues in verse 5. Happy are they whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord their God, who made heaven and earth, the sea and everything in it, who keeps faith, who keeps promises. This is our hope. This is our help. If we trust in mortals, even those that are very close to us, there may be some times in those trust falls of life when we find ourselves falling, where the arms or the hands may not be there, but not with God. Our God is a trustworthy God whose hands and arms are always outstretched, every single time, without fail. It is in God that we trust. Now, sometimes it's not just others too, but it's ourselves that we can't fully trust and we think we should. But even in those times too, it is God who will not fail us. And I know too, in preparing this sermon, there were times where I was feeling a little bit over anxious and reminding myself, because every sermon I preach, I try to also preach it for myself too, in addition to everyone else. And I try, in my human sinful way, to live each one out. And so I was reminded as I was getting a little anxious and a little worried, but wait a minute, I'm supposed to be trusting God too, which includes the whole process of this. Stay with it, but relax and let God lead the way. If we realize in life that we're getting a little too worried or too anxious about things, it's probably that we're trying to control or take responsibility for too much, even more than we're able to do. And if we let God have more of that, life goes so much better. And it's not the idea of letting go and letting God as if we walk away and God takes care of it for us. It's allowing ourselves to be that vessel for God to work through us. And I didn't mention this in the early church, but the flip side of that too is thinking comfortably that we've got it all going on, got it all figured out. And sometimes those of us who have graduate degrees have a sense of that too. Yeah, we know what's going on, got it figured out. That's another way of forgetting God and not trusting. So on the flip side, if we feel a little too comfortable that we have it all figured out, that's probably a good flag and a warning sign too, remembering, no, we're probably trying to hold too much in our own hands. Remember to trust God, because sometimes even our own hands will let us down. But God's hands and God's arms never will. So in God we trust is the title. And it's with a question mark. In God we trust? Do we really trust God in all these times and places? And of course, as humans, well, we always have more that we can trust. That's why we come back every week and have confession every week, to regain our sense of that more full trust in God. We find this idea of trusting in God in Psalm 146. We find it in Psalm 118, verses 8 and 9, about not trusting in princes. Again, it talks about this, but putting our trust in God. We find it in various places. And if we look big picture, basically we find that in a book called the Bible. The whole thing, really, if you look through, is a book of faith. It is a book about all the wanderings from the people from Egypt and Babylon and all the way to the cross with Christ and what the disciples did and the apostles afterwards and the work of the Spirit, all the way up to right here and right now. And it's a journey of faith all along the way. And part of our call, but also our gift, is to trust the Lord our God in this and in all things. So in God we trust. I hope by the end of the sermon, instead of having a question mark at the end of that, we'll have an exclamation mark at the end of it. And in addition to all these spiritual ways we're talking about, like in the Psalms throughout Scripture and how God has been there for us, I want to also mention some other ways of good news out in the world. We just saw from the children's sermon, we had those pennies that were given out, and in God we trust. And all our currency, of course, has that. In God we trust. Anybody know when the first piece of money for the U.S. was minted with "In God We Trust"? 1954, it's close. The first paper currency in 1957, but as far as coinage, actually 1864. And it was from a new ordinance, I think, in December of 1863. It was from the Secretary of the Treasurer for Abraham Lincoln. We don't know for sure if Lincoln had endorsed it or not, but probably so, given that it was his Secretary of the Treasury who did this. But then the first piece was a 2-cent piece that came out in 1864 from that. It said, "In God we trust." And there have been other coins since then that have come and gone with that phrase, but it was in 1950s, though, 1957, that then all the currency was made for that, and it actually became our national motto, "In God we trust." It was from an act of Congress in 1956, and then also approved by then President Dwight Eisenhower to put that on all of our U.S. currency and to make it a national motto. There had been the idea kind of loosely of E pluribus unum from the Great Seal of the U.S. back in, I think, 1782, of kind of like a motto, but this came more of our official motto in 1957, "In God we trust." Now, if you're like me, you may wonder, well, what I say sometimes is, I'm really thankful for that, but, if it were to be voted on today, how many of you think there's a chance it would pass today in today's society? Because I was thinking, no way, right? There's no way the U.S. today would do that. I was thinking the same thing myself, and I thought, well, what was it that had it happen then? So what was going around 1863 and 1864? And we had Abraham Lincoln as president. Yes, all the crisis of the Civil War. And then we know in our lives too, sometimes when we're in this intense crisis, it's then we remember God. And we remember that we need to put our trust in God. But what about 1957 and 56? This wasn't like Vietnam or Korea, right? Yes, it was the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union at the time, and had this whole sense of making a nation state that was atheist. So it was partially, I believe, in response to that too, but also the crisis of that no, we put our trust in God. Today too, we are kind of fragmented, and it seems like we're not in the same kind of crisis of that, but we might suspect that there's no way that anything like that would pass today. Well, here's the second part of our good news then with some of this, because it's amazing how much is actually happening out in the world with "In God We Trust." See, we often talk about how we can be that mouthpiece and that voice for God out in the world. Today, we also get the good news of hearing how out in the world there's already that mouthpiece for God that can inspire us. In the year 2001, and you can look these things up in Wikipedia, Google them, or various sources. In 2001, in the state of Mississippi, so not that many years ago, they made this whole new ordinance that every single public school, all the classrooms, the cafeterias, and libraries would have the motto, "In God We Trust," posted on them. Isn't that something? That's just a few years ago. And there have always been groups, too, that have protested against the idea of putting "In God We Trust." Most of them are atheist groups that have protested against this. But there's been this sense going on through of support for that. And there was a poll that was done by a combination of CNN and Gallup and USA Today, and it was done in 2003. And that joint poll found that 90% of Americans support having "In God We Trust" on our coinage and to continue that for our currency. So there's a tremendous amount of support for that still with our country. In the year 2006, the state of Florida made it their state motto. The same national state motto became "In God We Trust" in 2006 in Florida. And then in 2015, and there are all kinds of other examples too, but just little examples here and there, there's a police force up in Illinois. They put that on the squad car door, "In God We Trust." And that same year, 2015, in Childress, Texas, there was one of the atheist groups. It was the Freedom From Religion Foundation, the very same one that had the sign posted on Piedmont Road not too long ago, the one that we had the sermon about as well, and made an opportunity for a message saying that there is, enjoy this life, there is no afterlife. I think it's a Geico sign now, but that's what they had up for a while. And so it's that same organization that demanded that the police in that particular city in Texas take the "In God We Trust" off of their squad cars. And it was the police chief, Garcia, that responded back to the group in writing, and it was this, it was, quote, "Go fly a kite," unquote. It's not that I'm advising us to say things like that, but it's just that, I think we've been so shy sometimes as Lutherans and Christians, and that was just a statement of a little more salt, and we'll talk about salt in a coming up sermon too. That was a statement of some of that tough integrity, where you stand firm of who you are and stay consistent, where the police chief stood up and said, no, this is our trust. This is who we are as a people here, that we do have our trust in God. So I liked the saltiness of that and the speaking out of that. And that's some good news and affirmation for us, isn't it? Hearing this in church, that all this is happening out in the world. And just this year, too, a Democrat and Republican separately in the state of Florida, each of them bringing about legislation for even more propagation of this very motto, in God we trust. Both got passed to even further send out this news, in God we trust, in the state of Florida. And our neighboring state of Tennessee, and of course we know in Georgia too, there's some options of in God we trust for the license tag. In Tennessee, just in 2018, this year, same thing as what happened in Mississippi. All the public schools, classrooms, libraries, and the cafeteria, from what I understand, has in God we trust posted as the motto. That's even right here and right now, that's happening in 2018. So what we think wouldn't happen, look at the presence of the Spirit in the Lord and reaffirming us, and for us to also be reaffirming God. So as we live out our life, and hopefully not just in those times where they're critical, in the world wars or the civil wars or the cold wars, hopefully not just in the civil wars of our relationships or the cold wars of our relationships, do we then look and reach out to God. But may we in all times and in all places put our trust in God, because God is the one who every single time will always have those hands and arms outstretched and will not let us fall, will not let us go. Do not put your trust in princes, in mortals in whom there is no help. Happy are those who trust in the God of Jacob, whose help is in the Lord their God, who made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, who keeps promises forever. Lord God, thank you that in the world where we cannot always trust others, or at times even ourselves, thank you that you are a trustworthy God in all times and places, that you are a God of grace, that you are a God of mercy, that you are a God of forgiveness, that you are a God of justice, that you are a God of compassion, that you are a God of fulfilled promises, that you are a God of everlasting covenants and everlasting life. May we always put our hearts in trust in you, O Lord, our God. Amen.